Hello everybody and welcome back. My name is Kari and today I'm doing my January wrap-up. So I read 11 books somehow in this month. I think a lot of that has to do with the 24 and 48 hour readathon that I participated in. I'm going to include the 24 and 48 hour wrap-up in this video just because since I did read them in January and I'm posting this 3 days later, it makes a little bit more sense to me. Anyway, let's get started. Alright, so the first book that I read is Everlist by Sarah Holland. This is a book where time is a currency. It can be bled out of you, so you give blood and then through alchemy, the blood is transformed into basically like coins, if I understand correctly, and you can either eat them like candy or put them in your tea or whatever, and the coins are what is the time, so your blood is time. That means that the richer you are, the more time you have. So the queen, for example, has been around for 500 years or something. You follow the main character who is relatively poor, and she and her father live on the outskirts of this great big estate called Everlist. They were kicked out of Everlist, you learn fairly quickly, years ago, but you don't really know why, and you realize that there's something odd about this girl. Read the book if you want to find out what it is, because I thoroughly enjoyed this book. First of all, time as currency was actually executed quite well. I wasn't at all sure how it was going to be done because, I mean, blood equals time doesn't really make a whole lot of sense, but with the alchemy feeling, it made a lot more sense, and I thoroughly enjoyed it. There were some plot twists in there that had very specifically to do with the blood as currency. My biggest complaint was probably just the love almost triangle, and that is because it was an almost triangle, so I didn't mind that. Mostly it was just that it felt old to me. Maybe it's that I've been reading so much YA lately and the love triangles, the forbidden love is getting really old, which is entirely possible. Anyway, I did enjoy how it ended. I will say that, but throughout it just kind of felt a little old. Anyway, I gave this book a 4 out of 5 stars. Next is one of my favorite books of the month, which is The Forgotten Book by Mathilde Glaser. This follows a young girl named Emma, and she lives in Germany with her father, who is the dean, basically, of a boarding school. The boarding school is in a castle that's ancient in, I think, southern Germany. And it's an international school, so all these rich kids come there. And first of all, there is a bit of a romance, and it's basically that same old trope where they hate each other at first and then they end up really liking each other. I am total trash for that trope, I'm not gonna lie. I love it. It's one of the few things I can tolerate and will actively seek out as far as YA romance goes. That aside, the girl Emma finds a diary that seems to have been written in as a diary for hundreds of years. She starts writing in it and then realizes that the things she writes come true. She has to figure out why they're coming true, and there's a faun, and there's a lot of sort of mythology feel to it, which I really enjoyed, especially because part of those there's a story that runs throughout it with a faun or a satyr, and that felt almost very Beauty and the Beast-ish to me, and that's one of my favorite stories, so how could I say no? Also, the cover. I adore whoever does Mathilde Glaser's cover work because they are stunning. So I gave this book a 5 out of 5 stars. Then I read John Grisham's The Whistler, which is a legal thriller following 2 investigators from the Board of Judicial Conduct in Florida as they investigate a crooked judge. Except that nobody can really prove the judge is crooked, and they get a sort of anonymous tip. There's a couple of middle people in there, and they start the investigation. There's a lot of problems as they start the investigation because this judge is very well respected and very well connected, as most judges are. And so I enjoyed reading about that in a context that isn't reading the bloody rules. I also enjoyed the fact that there was an Indian reservation involved in this, the casinos, and all the politics surrounding that as well. So I really liked Lacey. She is the main character in this. She's incredibly well written. She's in her mid-30s, she's single, and her family is all telling her, get married, and she just kind of goes, nope, I don't need or want a guy, I'm happy, I'm good. And even when there is a relationship in this book, it's not forced, it's not immediate. I really liked that aspect of it. outside of the legal portion, which obviously I loved because I'm in law school. I think I gave this book a 4 out of 5 as well. And there is The Roundhouse by Louise Erdrich. I didn't enjoy this one so much. I ended up giving it a 3 out of 5. I think it did a good job simplifying the complexities of Indian law, because depending on who is involved and where the crime or the civil action occurred, it makes a difference as to which court you can go into and what kind of remedies you get. So this book follows a young boy, he's 13, and his mother gets raped. His father is a tribal judge, and the three of them have to figure out how to cope with what happened. I also think she did a really good job as far as all of their coping mechanisms, what they do, and how each of them relates to the other one or doesn't. My biggest problem was just the over-sexualization of this kid. And it wasn't even the kid was doing the over-sexualization, specifically of his aunt, which I don't know if this is normal. Obviously, I've never been a 13-year-old boy, and I know that hormones of both genders are out the wazoo when you're, 13 to 19, but nonetheless, it just felt forced and acutely uncomfortable for me to read about him imagining his aunt in that way, and I really could not stand it, and it went through the whole book, hence the reason it got 3 out of 5 stars. Then I read All the Light We Cannot See by Anthony Doerr. This book follows a young girl in the 1930s and 1940s Paris throughout the sort of rise of Hitler, and then as he invades France, and then, World War II happens. So I loved this book. I wasn't entirely sure what to expect, except that I'd heard really good things. The main character is blind, and so first of all, she reads books, but they're Braille, which is really fun, and her father makes these little miniatures for her so that she can learn her way around the city that she's in. And by miniatures, I mean he literally goes out and makes scale copies of all the houses, all the streets, all the benches, everything, and creates this little mini city for her. I don't even know. And she's really good with puzzles, so that plays a big part into it as well. I don't know, this book was so well done. The descriptions, especially from Marie, are amazing because they put you into her mindset without using colors or anything like that, because she went blind when she was about 6, so she doesn't really remember colors or shapes or anything like that. But it really brought you into her life. You also follow a young boy who is German, and he's brilliant with electronics, specifically radios and that kind of stuff, so he gets taken to this really fancy Nazi school. I really liked both of them, but Marie was definitely my favorite just for the fact that she was blind, and it is such a different way of reading a book. I gave this one 5 out of 5 stars. I also read the Aeneas Trilogy, which is by James Islington, and includes The Shadow of What Was Lost and An Echo of Things to Come. So these two books, which I can't seem to get a grip on for whatever reason, there we go. These two books were both really good. This one was a bit slower because it is the first one, so it's more of the world building and getting to know the characters. However, there is still a fair bit of action in this, but I still really enjoyed this book. It's a high fantasy, and it follows these kids, well, teenagers, they're I think 17-ish, as they have to fight this giant evil that is arising again in the north. There's about half of this book, not half, there's 100 pages out of 600 in the middle that don't make a whole lot of sense because there's time travel in these books. Characters go places out of the time stream, and it's confusing and amazing and just fantastic. And then in this book, the things that didn't make so much sense in this one start to make a little bit more sense, which is really nice because, I mean, I like when my books make sense. Anyway, there's also, one of my favorite characters is Kari-ng, just because of the complexities of his backstory, which you really start to get into in the second book. So this one had a fantastic quote, which I actually wrote down, and it is, "Certainty is hubris. It is arrogance and bluster, and those who claim it deserve nothing but to be mocked." I just thought that was absolutely fantastic because people are often so certain nowadays, and to say that it's hubris or basically pride to the extent of getting yourself killed, which is how I think of hubris, is awesome. These are just fantastic books. My one big complaint, this one, like I said, was a little bit slow because it's world building, but the world is really beautiful. He goes multiple places within the world. There's the North, and there are people who hate magic, and there are people who have magic. There's different types of magic and magic users, and I loved it. So this one was a bit slower just because it had to set all of that up, and there's a lot to set up, believe me. And then this one was faster because obviously it's all set up in this book. But my big problem in this one was just wording, to be honest. I think I gave this one a 4 out of 5, and I gave this one a 4.5. My biggest problem with the second one, which was simply there were some really awkward sentences and some crazy split infinitives that seemed to have been placed there simply to bug people like me. And then for the 24 and 48 readathon, I managed to read almost 6 books. So the first one is going to be my almost, and I'm less than 100 pages away from finishing this book, and that is Iron Gold by Pierce Brown. I managed to read about 400 pages of this book, and I only read 20 hours of the 24, primarily because my brain hurt. Like, I had been reading so much. I finished 5 books before this. I was exhausted. I needed to, not. And these books take a lot out of you as well. Iron Gold follows Darrow 10 years after the events of Morningstar, which is the third in the Red Rising trilogy, which is now turned Red Rising series. So the war is won at the end of Morningstar, and you follow them 10 years later. There's a lot more character development in this, which I thoroughly enjoyed, and there's also a lot more females in this book, which I also loved, because there are females and they're very strong, and you see them appear in Iron Gold. However, there's different strata in this society because of the color system that they have, and I liked being able to see that and see how these women react to a lot of this. I also did my first reread of the year, which is Dealing with Dragons by Patricia C. Reed. This book I gave a 5 out of 5 stars. It follows Cimmerine, who, as opposed to her parents who want her to go off and marry a nice prince with a big kingdom, she wants to fence and learn Latin and cook and do everything that is non-princessy. So when her parents tell her, you have to marry this prince over here, she says, no, I'm gonna go apprentice myself to a dragon. She does, and hijinks ensue. There's magic and wizards and obviously dragons. I absolutely adore this book. It's middle grade. It didn't take me very long to read, maybe an hour and a half. And it's just so great. There's snark in this. Cimmerine is this amazingly strong character who just doesn't take crap from anybody. She just kind of looks at the wizards and goes, you're an idiot, move on. And she doesn't let the dragons scare her into anything. I love this book. It was also the book that got me into fantasy, so I might have a bit of a bias. Then I read The Glass Spare by Lauren DeStefano. This is the story of a girl. She is the princess of a kingdom, but nobody knows what she looks like because she looks nothing like her parents, which I think is fairly typical in YA. She has the power to turn people into gemstones. There are rules to this power that she explores in it, and I think they did a good job of that. It wasn't just purely the Midas touch, except with gems. It wasn't as if she touched a book and it turned a gem or anything. There were rules, and I liked that. They were well executed. I also, strangely, liked the romance in this. It wasn't forced. It wasn't forbidden in the traditional sense. It wasn't any of the traditionalness. But I really liked that. It felt much better than a lot of the other YA romances that I've read. So I gave this book a 4 out of 5. And I gave it 4 out of 5 because the ending felt a little bit rushed. A little bit like there was so much more that could have happened. Goodreads says it's the first in a series, so hopefully there's more of these coming out, because then it would make perfect sense. But if there's no more of these coming out, then it ended too soon. I also read Jane Unlimited by Kristen Cashore. First of all, this cover you think is gorgeous, right? It's holographic, it's great. Wait for it, because there is an umbrella on the cover, and I have no idea why I'm so excited about an umbrella on the cover, but oh my gosh, I love this cover. It is just so cute. There's a freaking holographic umbrella on the cover. Anyway, calming down about the umbrella, So, first of all, this is just a very strange book. It's about Jane, whose aunt passes away and makes her promise that if Jane ever gets invited to this island, to Rebien's, French pronunciation aside, Jane will go. So Jane gets invited to the island. It's an island mansion of a billionaire. She goes, and strangeness ensues, basically. The first 2/5 of the book make perfect sense, they're chronological, and then you get to the 3rd/5 and you go, I don't know what's happening, but about halfway through you figure it out. I think you should definitely go into this book blind, or as blind as you possibly can be, because that's a great way to do it. It gets darker the farther in you go, and there's recurring motifs of frogs and umbrellas, and Jasper the dog is my favorite. There's not really romance in this, but there's almost like a bi sensation to her, to Jane, which I also really enjoyed. I can't explain it, you have to read the book, but this is such a good book. It did not at all disappoint for fans of Graceling, which I definitely am. I gave this book 5 out of 5. Then I read A Shadow Bright and Burning by Jessica Cluess. This is Victorian London. This girl finds out she's the first sorceress, I guess, in ages. There hasn't been a female sorceress since Joan of Arc, evidently. And they need her because there are these 7 giant demons tearing apart the UK, and she apparently is the only one who can stop them because guess what? There's a prophecy, guys. I know you're surprised. This book was okay. I ended up giving it about a 3 out of 5. I didn't necessarily... First of all, I didn't like the romance. This romance, it's a love triangle. It felt really old and overdone and just bad to me, so I didn't like that part. The writing was fine. There were a couple moments when I went, oh yeah, that's great. Basically, she's the only female character. There's one who is one of the main character's sisters, but you see her twice in the book. And that kind of drives me a little bit nuts. I think so much more could have been done. This book is only maybe 400 pages. You could have easily made it 5 or 6 and just put so much more into it, so much more context and background and world building, which I do think it lacked. Then I read Why I'm No Longer Talking to White People About Race by Rennie Edelage. I loved this book. I gave it a 5 out of 5. It's talking about racism in Great Britain and how white people get really defensive or really guilt-ridden, or they just completely block off any conversation about race because a lot of people, just in general, believe that we live in a colorblind society. My favorite part about this book, there were 2 actually. The first one is that for the first chapter she discusses the history. So she discusses Liverpool as a very big slave trading city. She discusses how all these immigrants and people of color came to reside in Great Britain, and sets the stage for how Great Britain became the way it is today regarding race. Then she goes through all of that. Okay, so there's 3 of my favorite parts. I apologize, I keep changing my mind. Anyway, the second favorite part was that as she continues going through, she brings in feminism and classism as well. It's not that it's just purely racism in this book. She talks about how feminism and racism have changed her perspective or been talked about or been put down or whatever in Great Britain and in her life, and then does the same with classism. I thought that was brilliant because so many books try to cubbyhole each of those subjects so that it's just race or just feminism or just classes, and you can't do that because they all do tangle together with each other. I loved the fact that Lodge combined all of them. And my third favorite part was the ending, because a lot of books don't tell you, well, this is how you fix it or this is what you can do. She does. She discusses how a lot of white people, when they start talking about race and they start becoming self-aware, they become guilty, and that guilt doesn't do anything for you. She talks about that in this book and talks about what you can do to help, even if it's just little things. So I loved the fact that she proposes ideas for you to take from this book and apply in real life. That is all of the books I've read in January, including the 24 in 48 readathon, which were the last 6. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, give it a big thumbs up down below. If you want to see more content like this, hit that subscribe button down below. As always, I will leave my Goodreads linked in the down bar. Until my next video. Bye!